and welcome back to our very interesting course called as Kurukshetra to Vrindavan. So in this course, we are trying to get a more deeper understanding of the Krishna Tattva and what does it mean to understand Krishna and make this whole transition from Krishna, who is this embodiment of all his might and power, as we see in his greatness, in his godhood, as is symbolized by his presence in Kurukshetra, to his very more personal, sweet, intimate understanding that we see in Vrindavan. And how do we make this transition? And how understanding Krishna in full, Yomam Janati Tattvataha, one who understands Krishna in the proper tattva, which is understanding the proper principle behind the philosophy of Krishna. When one understands that, that is when one can make this transition from Kurukshetra Krishna to Vrindavan Krishna. And in that context, we are taking the Bhagavad Gita as our base, and we are trying to bring out those 10 key concepts that the Bhagavad Gita talks about. So in yesterday's discussion, we began by understanding the first 3 concepts. In today's discussion, we will spend more time specifically understanding the nature of the absolute truth and the relationship of the absolute truth with his energies. That is going to be the theme. We are going to discuss 4 more tattvas, 4 more principles in today's discussion. So let's begin the discussion with the invocatory prayers. So joining your palms together. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Ajnanatimirandhasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Pristhaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swaminiti Namine. Namaste Saraswate Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarine. Jaya Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. Hare Krishna 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 Hare Hare, Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare. Hare Krishna. Let's very quickly set up the whiteboard. Okay. So this is the session number 2 of our course Kurukshetra to Vrindavana. So in yesterday's session, we actually saw these 3, the first 3 sutras. So the first sutra we saw that how Vedas are the highest pramana, or the highest proof for any spiritualist, especially in the Vedic tradition, right? That is, they are the highest proof. So Vedas are the best pramana or the proof, and based on that we try to understand that what the Vedas are trying to present, how Krishna is the absolute truth. That was the second principle we understood. Krishna is the absolute truth And the next principle we tried to understand was how that absolute truth has various energies. Absolute truth has various energies. So now in today's discussion, we'll try to understand what do I mean by energy of the absolute truth, and two, what is the relationship between the absolute truth and his energies? Are they the same? Are they the different? Right? So that's going to be the first theme. So we're going to discuss straight away with Sutra number 4 or Tattva number 4, where we try to understand that how the absolute truth and his energies are simultaneously one and different. Right? That is going to be our theme. So let's take a new sheet. Right? So Sutra number 4. Absolute truth and energies are simultaneously one and different. Right? So to understand this concept, let's take a very, very simple example. What do I mean by an object and its energies? Let's first relate with something very tangible for us. So let's take the example of this pen, right? So the pen is the object, right? And this object has certain characteristics in the form of its shape, its texture, its color, its weight, its feel in the hand, its utility, of course. So all these descriptions that we hear about this pen are its qualities. Now, the important discussion that Vedic scholars would have is the pen and its penness, right? When I use the expression penness, like whatever makes it a pen, all the qualities that we spoke about, are they two separate things, right? Can the pen exist independent of its penness, or can the penness exist independent of the pen, right? Can the solidity, can its utility, the texture, all these characteristics that I spoke of, can they exist independent of the pen, right? So we understand that how the qualities and the object, they cannot be separated. They are one, but at the same time, they are different in the sense that anything long is not pen. Anything that writes need not be a pen. It could be a pencil, right? Or something else too, right? Anything that has this kind of a black color and this texture and the feel need not be a pen. So there is this very unique dynamic between an object and its description. The object is not its description, and at the same time, the object is not independent of its description. So there is this a kind of a simultaneous oneness and difference between the object and its characteristics. By description, I mean characteristics. Right? So there cannot, you cannot isolate these two things. Right? So this is the principle that is very nicely spoken of in the Vedic literatures. A very important statement called as Shakti Shaktimator Shaktimator Abhedaha. So these two, Abhedaha, meaning that how the energy and the energetic cannot be separated. They are non-different. And yet, at the same time, there has to exist some difference, because the energy in itself is not the energetic, right? So Shakti here is the energy, and Shakti Mator is the energetic, and they are non-different, right? So this is, this is the description. Yesterday in the previous session, in response to one of the Q&A aspect, we spoke about it briefly. So let's elaborate on this concept. Why this principle has been a subject of great discussion in the Vedic literatures. So when we are talking about Krishna and his energies, the relationship between Krishna and his energies, specifically we are talking about his material energies in this case, right? We're talking about his material energies. This is basically this creation. Understanding this interrelationship between Krishna and his creation is very interesting, because when we defined Krishna as the absolute truth, the nature of this absolute truth is, it is Sat, Chit and Ananda. And the nature of Sat means something that is unchanging. On the contrary, we see that the nature of this creation is, it is always changing. And this is where we come into a very deep philosophical dilemma, that if Krishna, if the whole is a creation independent of Krishna, or is it related to Krishna? The moment we say that the creation is independent of Krishna, because you see, the nature of Krishna is, it is unchanging. The nature of the creation, it is changing. It seems like they don't have a relationship with each other. If indeed the creation is coming from the Supreme Lord, it has to share the same characteristics, because there has to be a lot of similarity between the cause and effect. It is just like saying that, a cow gave birth to a donkey, for example, right? A cow doesn't give birth to a baby donkey, it gives birth to a calf, a baby cow, or a bull, right? So there has to be a very strong relationship between the cause and effect, right? So if Krishna is the cause, if he is the cow and the creation is the calf, then there has to be similarities. But apparently it seems like Krishna is giving birth to the cow is giving birth to a donkey, because it seems like the material world and Krishna are so opposite in nature. And so how do I explain this apparent contradiction, right? So this is a creation and Krishna, are they one and the same? Because the moment I say that Krishna and his creation are totally different, then we are indicating that, so if the argument is Krishna and creation are different, or in a sense, by different mean are independent, let's use the word independent, then ontologically we are presenting that the creation is something outside the dominion of the Supreme Lord. But we understand from yesterday, we quoted the Isha Upanishad and the Om Purnamada prayer, which says that absolute truth is complete, this material world is also complete, and the emanations coming out of the Supreme Lord are also complete. So indicating that there's a relationship between the Lord and his creation, right? So the creation cannot be independent of God. If Krishna is like this superset, the collection of everything, then the creation also has to be part of that everything. Because the moment you say creation is outside of Krishna, then you are saying that Krishna is not complete. You see? So the completeness of the absolute truth, by definition, should mean that the creation should also be part of Krishna. But then how can part of Krishna be so different from Krishna, right? So this is where a philosophical dilemma comes in. So one way of resolving this argument that Krishna and this creation are independent, one way of resolving it is saying, what creation are you talking about? There is no creation. In fact, this whole creation that you see is one big illusion. There is nothing called as creation. What we call as the creation is just a projection that we all have created. It's an illusion that we have created. So technically, illusion in Sanskritam is called as vivarta, and this theory is called as vivartavada. Vivartavada. Vada means like a theory. So we'll call it as the theory of illusion. That this entire creation is one big illusion. And to support that argument, they very interestingly, this class of philosophers, they very interestingly, literally stretch the meaning of the word Maya. Maya means illusion, right? So this whole world is one big Maya. This philosophy is also popularly known as Mayavad, presented by Sripad Shankaracharya, but technically it's called as Vivartavada. So if you see, the genesis of this Vivartavada theory has been that Sripad Shankaracharya, he wanted to establish the supremacy of the position of Krishna or Narayan, and how this Narayan is the supreme personality, and he is the source of everything. There is this only one absolute truth. The Supreme Lord is one. Unlike prior to Shankara's philosophy, there were many other philosophers, especially the Karma Mimamsaka philosophers, who would say that how there are multiple gods. But to establish the concept that no, there is only one supreme absolute truth, right? So, and that one absolute truth is Narayan. To establish the supreme position of Narayan, Shankaracharya, he explained this concept of this one absolute truth. But then immediately a problem comes. The nature of that absolute truth, if it is unchanging, it is Sat, unchanging. He is supreme. He is not affected by this material energy. If he is indeed so infallibly great, then how is this creation, which is part of him, fallible? How is it susceptible to change? So one way he tried to resolve that contradiction is just by saying, what creation are you talking about? I don't see anything. This is all one big mighty illusion. So this philosophy is, this concept is also explained by using the statement Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya. Brahma means that supreme divine. Divine. Satyam means truth, which means that is all that exists. That is the reality, truth or reality. And Jagat here means this world. Mithya means an illusion, right? So the supreme absolute truth is the only reality. Everything else, this whole world is one big illusion. So that way, Shankaracharya very conveniently or very intelligently, he has avoided the need to establish the reality of this world, and thereby he established the supreme infallible position of the Supreme Lord, right? But then the moment you say that the world is an illusion, then it creates so many dilemmas, especially when it comes to the understanding the nature of the Jiva, right? On the contrary, there's another way of resolving this contradiction, which is what the Vaishnavacharyas use. While this philosophy is called as Vivartavada, there's another way of resolving this argument by saying that, look, the absolute truth is unchanging, but his energies are changing. Right? So energies means Shakti. So this particular philosophy is called as Shakti Parinama Vada. Shakti Parinama Vada, or the theory of transformation of energies. The theory of transformation of energies. Right? And this theory also establishes that how the energy and the energetic are simultaneously one and non-different. Shakti, Shaktimator Abhidaha. Right? So based on this, how do the Vaishnavacharyas explain this concept of absolute truth? Right? So the Gita very beautifully talks about these important ontological elements. Let me write this word, ontological truths or ontological elements. Ontology is basically the theory of being, or the different tattvas that exist. Right? So the Bhagavad Gita basically talks about these 6 important philosophical concepts. Right? What are they? It begins by talking about Ishvara. Ishvara here means the supreme controller. The moment there is a supreme controller, then the controller is a controller only when there is something controlled. So what are the things that the supreme controller is controlling? So there are 2 aspects. Jiva. Jiva here means the living entities. And Prakruti, which is the material nature. Now, these 3 truths, Ishvara, Jiva, and Prakriti, they are not independent of each other, but rather they all share a unique relationship among them. So, Ishvara and Prakriti, Jiva and Prakriti, Jiva and Ishvara, they all are interconnected. So, what are these interconnections specifically? Ishvara and Prakriti are connected through the medium of Kala, or the time factor. So you can say time is like the instrument Ishvara uses to manipulate and trigger action in Prakriti. The moment time factor sets in, Prakriti starts to stir. If you remember, in one of our previous courses, I gave the example of a pot, right? When there is a pot and when there is fire outside the pot, the fire never actually enters the pot physically, but through the medium of its energy called as heat, it enters into the pot and cooks the ingredients inside the pot. So Prakriti is like those ingredients. It is the materials, right? And that Prakriti starts to get agitated and stirred into motion. The material energy gets stirred into motion by Ishvara's glance in the form of this time factor. So time is that relation, time is what that creates a relationship between Ishvara and Prakriti. So Ishvara is literally controlling this material nature, not directly. Ishvara never comes in direct contact with Prakriti, but to the instrument of time, using the ladle of time, he stirs. Using the heat, he enters into the pot and he causes the Prakriti to set into motion. Likewise, Jiva and Prakriti also share a relationship, right? This is called as karma. Right? Karma here means the law of action and reactions. So Jiva is bound to Prakriti due to the law of karma. As long as that karmic connection exists, Jiva identifies with that Prakriti. Jiva is not Prakriti. Jiva identifies with Prakriti. The spiritual consciousness becomes influenced by material consciousness, or it is bound to material consciousness because of this karma factor, right? Or rather, you may even say karma facilitates that binding to happen. Right? We'll talk about this binding aspect in the very next sutra, tattva. And Ishvara and Jiva together also they share a relationship. That connection between Jiva and Ishvara is the concept of yoga. So basically, Bhagavad Gita talks about these 6 concepts: Ishvara, Kala, Prakriti, Karma, Jiva, and the liberating process, yoga. All these 6 topics are the main theme that we study throughout the Bhagavad Gita, spread across different chapters. Right? So if you remember our study of the Bhagavad Gita, studying, so all these factors together, right? All the 6 factors that you see together they are called as the absolute truth. Prabhupada, in the introduction to Bhagavad Gita, he talks about these factors, especially the 5 factors, Ishvara, Jiva, Prakriti, Kala, and Karma. He talks about these factors and he says that how all these factors together are called as the absolute truth, and that absolute truth is Krishna. Not independent of Krishna. All these energies of Krishna, namely Ishvara, Kala, Prakriti, Karma, Jiva. So when I use the word Ishvara, I'm specifically referring to that particular form of the Lord who's hands-on involved with the creation. Like for example, Brahma, Shiva, Vishnu, etc. They are the creator, maintainer, and destroyer of this creation. So they are hands-on involved with this creation. And Krishna, of course, is beyond even Brahma, Vishnu, and they are the mere gunavataras of Krishna, right? They are the guna expansions of Krishna, right? So the absolute truth is beyond all these, but at the same time, the absolute truth is also this. So this is the beautiful understanding of simultaneous oneness and difference, right? So this is how we understand that while the absolute truth has all these energies are simultaneously one with the absolute truth in the sense that they are not independent of him. So when we use the word oneness, when we use the principle of oneness, we are saying they are oneness in a sense that they are not independent of absolute truth. And at the same time, when we talk about the difference, we are basically saying that they are literally not the absolute truth, right? Or if I may put in another way, how Krishna is in everything. Krishna is in everything, yet everything is not Krishna. Right? Does it make sense? Krishna is in everything, and yet everything is not Krishna. Krishna is there in this pen, but it is not that, I start worshipping this pen. Right? So this is the understanding of the Vaishnava understanding of the Shakti Parinamavadas, or the understanding that how the Supreme Lord, he expands into all his energies, and at the same time, while he is non-different from his energies, he is also independent of his energies. He is different from his energies, like that. This is the theme that we saw in the 9th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, when Krishna spoke about this Rajavidya, how we discussed how Krishna is and he is not. Krishna is everything, and yet he is not everything. Krishna is matter, yet he is not matter. Krishna is spirit, yet he is not spirit. Krishna is the time factor, yet he is not the time factor. So Krishna is blank and Krishna is not blank, if you remember in that discussion, right? So this is the understanding of the oneness and difference of his energies, and this can be very nicely understood through some very good examples. So let's take up two very popularly used examples in the Vedic scriptures. The first example I would like to quote is the example of the sun. So imagine there is a sun which is giving out all his energies in the form of light. And what does the sun do? So there is water, right? So the sun, through the medium of its heat, causes all this water to evaporate and create clouds. And these clouds eventually they precipitate, right? And they cause a phenomenon of rain. But amidst all of this, is the sun anyway getting affected? Right? Everything is happening because of the sun. Literally, all the the evaporation, the condensation, the precipitation, it's all happening because of the sun. But yet the sun is situated completely aloof from this entire operation, right? So without the sun, nothing can happen, and yet the sun is completely unaffected by all these operations. So this is a beautiful example given with respect to Krishna and his creation, how everything in this creation is happening because of the Lord's energies, because of the Lord, and yet the Lord is completely aloof from his creation, right? So this is the example quoted, that and another example which is also quoted, which you might have heard from one of our previous lectures, right? The second example. So here is the example of how the sun is involved in rains, yet unaffected by rains. The other example which is quoted, again, that also involves the sun, but this example is used to explain the nature of the relationship between Ishvara and Jiva. So here is a sun, and the sun is reflecting its light, and that sunlight gets bounced off the moon, and it provides now moonlight. So here, this is our sunlight. So technically, what we refer to as moonlight is actually sun's light, right? Because the light of the moon cannot exist independent of the sun. Yet we see moonlight, or in this case sun's light, is so much different from sunlight, because moonlight is cooling, sunlight is warm, moonlight is white, sunlight is yellow, right? We see moonlight in the night time, we see sunlight in the daytime. So there is so much of difference. No sane person will call moonlight and sunlight are the same. They are totally different, right? And yet the moonlight is non-different from sunlight, right? So this is another example that how sunlight is totally different from moonlight, yet moonlight is same as sunlight. So this example is quoted specifically to explain the nature, the relationship between Jiva's consciousness and Ishvara's consciousness, the Supreme Lord's consciousness. So the Jiva here has no consciousness of his own. Technically, if you see, just like how all the light has to come from the sun, the source of all this consciousness is the Supreme Lord. what the Jiva is doing is bouncing the consciousness of the Lord. Yet, when the consciousness bounces off the Jiva, it becomes Jiva's consciousness. It becomes independent. It becomes completely different. Yet, Jiva's consciousness is non-different from Ishvara's consciousness, because that principle of consciousness or awareness is coming from the Supreme Lord. So this is how we see there is the simultaneous oneness and difference between the energies of the Lord. While the previous example is more showing the oneness and difference between the Lord and the material energy, the second example is showing the oneness and difference between the Lord and his Jiva energy, right? So this principle, we have to understand that how the Lord has different energies, the Absolute Truth has different energies, and yet these energies are simultaneously one and different. So specifically now, we will elaborate more on trying to understand this Jiva energy. While the Absolute Truth has multiple energies, we will try to understand that this Jiva is known as marginal energy. Right? So that is the fifth principle that we'll try to understand. Jiva is marginal. Now, what do I mean by marginal energy, right? So understanding the nature of the Jiva also has been, a subject of great debate. It's like some philosophers, they like to explain that Jiva is same as matter. This is a very tamasic philosophy. In fact, if you see, all modern science is based on this philosophy. They like to say that there is nothing called as consciousness or soul. Everything is just a chemical reaction within your body. What you call as life is just a chemical reaction within your body. So this is a very tamasic explanation of the nature of the Jiva. Then there's another set of philosophers who like to explain that actually, this soul or spirit exists only in human beings and not in animals. Spirit exists only in humans and not in other forms, like say animals or insects or birds, etc., aquatics, etc. It doesn't exist in that. So this is actually, in fact, for many years, many popular world cultures also believed that even among humans, only men had souls, women didn't have souls. So they were a group of philosophers thinking like that also, right? So this is also a very tamasic / rajasic philosophy. It's a combination of tamas and rajas, right? Then another group of philosophers like to say, actually, all forms of life are spirit. All forms of life are spiritual, but their destination is material. Right? What do I mean by destination is material? Meaning that we are all spirit souls, and the goal of our life is to go to higher planets and just enjoy good life, going to heaven and enjoying good life. So that is a very rajasic philosophy. Like the karma kanda philosophy suggests this kind of an understanding, right? Then there's another class of philosophers that like to explain that actually we are all spirit, right? And the goal is that undifferentiated spirit. What do I mean by undifferentiated spirit? Where a supreme spiritual state where there is no difference. It's all just one, or like that Brahman understanding. So this is a very sattvic philosophy, but still it is sattva guna is also it's not pure. It is still under the one of the material gunas. If you want to go to a philosophy which is beyond the gunas, the right understanding is that we are all spirit, right? And our goal is a very personal goal is very personal in the spiritual world, right? So this is the a philosophy which is beyond the gunas, right? So this is the, in terms of the end destination of the jiva and the understanding the nature of the jiva. Is it material? Is it spiritual? If it's material, then what is its destination? So that these are a few deliberations on that. Specifically the marginal nature of the jiva is very nicely explained in the Shvetashvatara Upanishad and the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. So I'd like to read a specific quote from the Shvetashvatara Upanishad. This I'm quoting from 4.8.10 of Shvetashvatara Upanishad, which says, the controller of Maya, the Supreme Lord, creates the material universe by Maya. The Jiva, different from the Lord, falls under the control of Maya in this material world. So the Lord has this energy called as Maya, and the Jiva comes under the control of this Maya. In this material world, and Maya is an energy of the Lord, and the Lord is a controller of that Maya. Yeah. So this is a concept that we hear in the Bhagavad Gita also. Daivi eshi gunamame mama Maya duratyaya. So this spiritual energy of mine, which is Maya Shakti, the Jiva is under the influence of that. So how when even in the 7th chapter, text number 5, Krishna also says, Aparayam tu anyas prakriti vidhime param jiva bhutam mahabaho ya edam jaharayate jagat. That beyond these 8 physical elements, earth, water, fire, air, ether, mind, intelligence, and false ego, there is this apara energy, para energy, different from these 8 is my spiritual potency, right? And the nature of the spiritual potency is that ya edam jaharayate jagat. Yeah. So what is this doing? It is struggling with this material nature, and they are trying to sustain this whole material world because of its own selfish desires. So that is how the jiva is under the influence of this Maya, like that. And the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad gives little more deeper insight. This I'm quoting from 4.3.18, where it says that how just as a large fish living in the river wanders from one bank to another, so the jiva is equipped to wander in the karana waters between the material and spiritual worlds. Meaning that the jiva, because of its marginal nature, it can either enter into a spiritual state or be in spiritual consciousness, or it can be influenced to be in a material state or in material consciousness. So Srila Prabhupada, when he describes this concept of marginal or tataksha shakti, he would give the example of the beach. So when there is a sea beach, the part which is close to the water, sometimes it is under the influence of water, and when the water recedes away, it is under the influence of land. So you cannot call it, is it land or water? You cannot exactly describe. So the nature of the jiva is like that. It is sometimes under spiritual potency, sometimes under material potency, like that. So specifically explaining this nature of the jiva, and especially the conscious energies of the Lord. The material energies, they have no consciousness. That is pretty clear. But regarding describing the conscious energies of the Lord, so we understand that the Lord's expansions can be broadly classified into two categories. First category is called as Swamshas. Swamshas are all the avatars of the Lord. Right? Then there are the Vibhinnamshas, or the separated energies of the Lord. These are basically the Jivas. Vibhinna means separated energies. Right? So regarding the nature of this, this is a concept that, if you remember, we studied in the Bhagavad Gita in 15th chapter, when Krishna explains the different kinds of Purushas that exist. He says, Dvauyamau Purushau Loke Kshara Akshara Evacha. So I'm quoting from Bhagavad Gita, 15th chapter, text number 16 and 17. Dvauyamau Purushau Loke Kshara Akshara Evacha. So there are the Kshara Jivas, fallible, and the Akshara, the infallible Jivas. So Kshara here means basically the conditioned souls, and there are the Aksharas, or the liberated souls. So there are these two kinds of Jivas, conditioned and liberated. Kshara Sarvani Bhutani Kutastu Akshara Uchyate, like that. Then Uttama Purushastu Tva Anyaha Paramatmeti Udahrita Yo Lokatrayam Avishya Bhivarti Avya Ishvaraha. Beyond these two, Uttama Purushastu Tva Anyaha, beyond these two, there is also another Uttama Purusha, or the Purushottama, right? Who is the Supreme Lord, right? Who is the direct personal expansion. In this case, the Paramatma, Paramatmeti Udahrita, referred to as the Paramatma. So regarding the conscious energies of the Lord, we understand that there is the personal, the Swamshas, the avatars of the Lord, and there is the Jiva, right? So this Jiva, because owing to its marginal potency nature, it can be either in a liberated state or in a conditioned state. So by liberated state, meaning it can be influenced by spiritual consciousness, or it could be influenced by material consciousness. So that is the nature of the Jiva energy. That's why the Jiva is always referred as marginal potency, right? Then, because of its marginal nature, there are two possibilities, as we discussed. So let's write that. That is also another tattva, that is, because the Jiva is marginal in nature, the Jiva can exist in two particular states, where the Jiva is bound by Maya, so that is tattva number 6 that we will try to discuss. And because it is bound, and because of its marginal nature, Jiva can also be liberated. It is not that we are eternally bound. We also have a potential to experience liberation. And now we are going into the deeper subject of the Bhagavad Gita and the spiritual science. So far, we've been trying to understand the nature of the absolute truth, is different energies. But what does it mean to you and me? This is a very important aspect, that because of the marginal nature of the Jiva, it has the potential to be bound, but it also has the potential to be liberated. So this is something we'll try to discuss in the remainder of the session today. So very quickly. So first is the sixth concept, how there are bound Jivas. Bound Jivas. So what does it mean, to be bound? So we understand that how, we discuss, because of this Maya Shakti of the Lord in the Bhagavad Gita 7:14, we discuss Daivi Eshi Gunami Mama Maya Durateya. So how this Maya Shakti, it binds the Jiva, right? And once the Jiva is bound, if you remember, we discussed that how this conditioning happens. The Jiva gets conditioned. Jiva is conditioned to material consciousness. So when we use terms like the Jiva is in the material world or the Jiva is in the spiritual world, understand that it is the Jiva's consciousness is tuned to material consciousness. That is what we mean by Jiva is in material world. And likewise, when we say Jiva is in spiritual world, we are referring to Jiva is tuned. The consciousness is tuned to spiritual consciousness. Because ultimately, it's about interaction at level of consciousness, right? But the soul in itself is always pure. It is the soul's consciousness which is what is getting conditioned, right? That is what we discussed in the 13th chapter, if you remember, when we discussed the interaction between Purusha and Prakriti. Prakritim Purusham Cheva Vidhi Anadi Ubhavapi Vikarams Gunams Cheva Vidhi Prakriti Sambhavan. Material nature and living beings both should be understood beginningless. Their transformations and the modes of matter are products of material nature. So nature is said to be the cause of material cause and effect, whereas living entity is the cause of various sufferings and enjoyment in this world. So what does it mean to be bound to material consciousness? If you remember, we discussed this example that how when a person looks into a mirror, but now this is not an ordinary mirror, it's a distorted mirror. So right now this person is perceiving themselves through their reflection. Now when the reflection distorts, sometimes if it becomes like one of those crazy mirrors in the circus, sometimes when the reflection looks long, one thinks, oh yes, look, I have become so long and tall and handsome, right? Or sometimes when the reflection distorts, one looks very short and tiny and puny, one thinks, oh, I've become so like a dwarf, like a midget, right? So then one becomes very sad. But actually what is changing here, it's not the person. The soul is never changing, because the soul by nature is also unchanging. It is also Sat. But the soul's perception, that is its consciousness, is going through its distortions. And that is what it means. That's what Prakriti does. So when nature is said to be the cause of all material cause and effects, right? So all these distortions which are happening, they are happening in the material space. But the cause of various suffering and enjoyment is because of the living entity. So because of this identification of consciousness, right? Because of that identification level of consciousness, the soul is thinking that I'm bound, right? That is why in so 20 to 22, in the 22nd verse, it is said, Purushaha prakutistohi bhungte prakutijan gunan karanam gunasangasya sad asad yonishu janmashu. That a living entity in material nature, thus following this way of life, enjoys the three modes of material nature. So actually this binding of consciousness is happening due to the influence of the three gunas. The sattva, rajas and tamas, think of these three gunas are the channels through which the consciousness is being expressed. Ideally, we should be expressing in Shuddha Sattva, that is beyond, independent of the three gunas. But due to its conditioned nature, the soul is expressing its consciousness under the influence of these three gunas, guided by these three gunas. And so these gunas are like the invisible shackles which is binding the jiva's consciousness to matter, right? And that is what it means to be bound. And this binding happens again very nicely. This Maya Shakti is described so beautifully in the Vedic scriptures that she has two potencies. Avaranatmika Shakti. Avarana means covering. Avarana Atmika Shakti, which means covering potency. That is completely, it engulfs the Jiva, completely veils the Jiva, right? And the second thing it does is it projects Vikshepatmika Shakti. Means it creates a false projection. And this is how the soul gets bound in this material world, right? So if those of you who've been following our courses online, you would have heard this discussion many times. I mentioned this before, how this covering is what is manifested as avidya. Avidya means spiritual ignorance. And that moment the soul forgets its real identity, it becomes ignorant of its real identity, it enters into some kind of a state of spiritual amnesia. And that is its covering potency that it does. And moment the avidya comes, the moment you forget your real identity, you cannot remain identityless for a long time. You have to adopt a false identity. So immediately the soul's consciousness is projected into what is called as asmita, which is a false identity. And the moment we get false identity, we start developing raga or false attachments and dvesha, which is false aversions. Literally all the things that we think we are interacting with in this world, all our emotions that we are kind of identifying with the things of this world are just basically a product of our false identities. Just think about this. This is actually a very, very deep concept. Literally every attachment and aversion that you have in this world is centered around a false identity that you are holding so sacred within your consciousness. The moment you liberate yourself from that false identity, automatically you will see your attachments and aversions are gone. Like we may be attached to a particular nation or some national identity, or with your national sports team or something like that. When your team wins, you become so happy. When your team loses, you become so sad, right? But that's all coming from a false identity of attaching to a particular nation and that particular team. The moment you distance yourself from that, then whether the team wins or loses, you always remain in an equipoised state. You don't get unnecessarily elated or unnecessarily depressed, right? So this attachments and aversions, as they deepen further, if you don't work on them, as they deepen further, they create what is called as abhinivesha. Abhinivesha means actually fear of death, but it is a very, very deep, insecure state of being, right? So this abhinivesha is the material, where the material fever is at its peak, like that. So this is the story of all the bound jivas. They become so bound to this material world, they become so obsessed with this material world, that death is that one phenomena that shakes them out of all their materialistic conceptions. So immediately they want to, they are fear. There's an instinctive fear of death. Abhinivesha literally means instinctive fear of death. That comes because over the lifetimes we become so absorbed in our attachments and aversions that we cling on to them. Clinging on to life, that's another symptom of this abhinivesha, right? So that is how this the bound jivas, they get trapped in this whole cycle of this material world, and they go through the cycle of birth, death, old age, disease, again birth, death, old age, disease, right? Or birth, disease, old age, death, right? They get trapped in this whole cycle. But this is not our eternal state. Because of our marginal nature, unlike matter is always bound. Matter is always without any cognizance. But we, the jivas, we are marginal in nature, which means we also have a potential within us to be liberated, right? And that is an important principle that we need to understand. The Jiva or liberated Jivas or basically we have a potential to get liberated, right? So again, I'd like to quote from Shvetashvatara Upanishad. Yeah, very nicely it says that when the Jiva looks towards the Supreme Lord, worthy of his worship, his lamentation disappears and he attains glory as the servant of the Lord. Right? Jushtam yada pashyati anyam isham asya mahimanam iti vita shokaha. When he gives up that shoka means that lamentation that the Jiva goes through, that abhinivesha that we spoke about earlier, that instinctive fear of death, that clinging on to material life, all that goes away when the Jiva turns towards the Supreme Lord, right? And this turning towards the Supreme Lord, how does it begin? So this liberation process begins, as we discussed from the Shvetashvatara Upanishad, right? This is from 4.7, yeah, of the Shvetashvatara Upanishad, where it says that how the liberation process begins by turning towards the absolute truth. So right now, the Jiva is turning towards its own ego, right? But once you go deeper and deeper, right now, so if you think of the how the soul's consciousness is right now, if this is how the soul is, the soul is covered by these different layers of ego, the intelligence, the mind, the senses, and the sense objects of this world, right? That is outermost layer. So right now, the soul is so busy looking outwards, it's trying to identify with its ego or its intelligence or its mind or the senses or the sense objects. But slowly, as the soul starts to turn inwards and inwards and inwards, as the soul turns inwards, the soul of the soul is a Supreme Lord. And as one turns inwards, as one turns to the absolute truth, one begins one's journey. And again, the same Shvetashvatara Upanishad in 6.3, it explains that the journey of turning towards the absolute truth begins. The journey begins by turning towards a guru. Right? So again, very nicely, it quotes that how that just by having that firm conviction in the words and teachings of a spiritual master, one will start developing all the divine qualities and start working towards liberation. And this is a theme that we saw in the Bhagavad Gita also, when Arjuna in 2.7, we saw how Arjuna, when he was completely confused about what he needs to do, he turns towards Krishna, accepts him as his spiritual master, right? And also we saw in how in text number 34, Tadvidhi pranipatena pariprashtena sevaya, that how one needs to understand the spiritual knowledge, one needs to turn towards a guru, like that. And that is how the liberation process of the Jiva begins. So now that brings about a very important question, that what is liberation? Right? Is liberation a state where you completely sublimate your existence, or is liberation a state where you become completely, it's like you grow some kind of a halo around your head or something. People have all kinds of understanding. So the Bhagavad Puran gives a very nice explanation in the second canto, 10th chapter, text number 6. It explains Muktir hitva anyata swarupena vyavastita. So mukti or liberation means to be situated, vyavasthita, to be situated in one's original form or state. Swarupena, swarupa, in one's original form or in one original spiritual state. Right? This is a theme that even Patanjali also in the last sutra, in the 196 sutra of the book, he says that what is that state of kaivalya? Purushartha shunyam gunanam pratipashvaha kaivalyam swarupena vyavasthita chit shaktirva iti. To be situated in one swarupa as the spiritual potency, like that. So this is the definition of mukti, right? So very nicely, so this specific kind of a mukti is what is called as swarupa mukti. So which means to say that liberation is not a change of existence, but a change of consciousness, right? So it is not about giving up this world, but rather even one can still be part of this world and still be in a liberated state of consciousness, because it's all about your consciousness. However, there is another state also, which is called as Vastu Mukti, where one even gives up this material world, gives up the connection to this material world, where one gives up one's gross and subtle bodies also. Right? This is very nicely described in the Chandogya Upanishad. And see what happens to such a soul. What happens to someone when they give up their subtle and gross bodies? Easy to understand a living liberated person, because at least they are part of this world, and whatever they are doing in a liberated consciousness. But what about someone who gives up this gross and subtle bodies? Does the soul just merge into divinity? Or does the soul just annihilate itself because it has no desires? A liberated person has no desire. So does it mean the soul just vanishes? No. Look at this beautiful description given in the Chandogya Upanishad. The Chandogya Upanishad, I'm reading from chapter 8, text number 12, chapter 8, section 12.3. It says, having attained liberation, giving up the gross and subtle bodies, the jiva becomes equipped with a spiritual effulgent form. So first thing that happens is the jiva experiences a spiritual effulgent form. So that is the swarupa of the jiva, and he is a spiritual person. The spirit is it has its own personality, and in the spiritual world he eats, plays, and becomes absorbed in bliss. Sa uttama purusha sa tatra paryeti jakshan kridan ramyamanaha. So he eats, yakshan, kridan means playing around, right? And he becomes absorbed in bliss. So basically one gets absorbed in spiritual activities. This is the nature of the dynamic nature of spiritual reality that we discussed in the previous session, that liberation in the spiritual context is not some dry, boring, abstract oneness, but rather it's a very, very dynamic state where a lot of spiritual activities are happening, right? And that is what a liberated jiva experiences. And more specifically, and we'll conclude with this one last point, the Chandogya Upanishad further, it very nicely explains 8 characteristics of such a liberated soul. Again, Chandogya Upanishad, it talks about 8 characteristics of liberated soul. So what are they? It says, such a jiva is without sin. no sin. Then free from old age. Next is deathless. Fourth is extremely peaceful, because at that stage the soul has no material, na shoshati na kankshati, has no material hankering and lamentation, is devoid of selfish desire. Because our selfish desires are born from our ego, such a liberated soul doesn't identify with one's material ego, is free from thirst and hunger, basically. What do I mean by free from thirst and hunger? Right now we experience thirst and hunger because we need, our body and soul are so disconnected. We need some external means to nourish the body. But such a living, liberated person, or even the spiritual world, for example, it is not that when the soul has spiritual body, it is constantly hungry. No, the spirit in itself is very self-satisfied. Yet, for the sake of play, it goes through these pastimes of eating and playing and drinking and so on, as we discussed earlier, right? And next, the seventh characteristics of such a liberated soul, only desires to favorably serve the Lord. Only desires to favorably serve the Lord, right? And finally, the last characteristic of such a liberated soul is all desires get fulfilled. Right? So these 8 characteristics, it is described, they don't exist in conditional jiva. A conditioned soul is not free from sin, is bound to death because of its material identification, has to go through old age, definitely is not peaceful because of the ego is always self-centric, and because of that one has to maintain one's body through food and water, goes through phenomena of thirst and hunger, and doesn't may sometimes desire to serve the Lord, but that is not the exclusive or the only desire. Unlike a liberated soul, that they have only desire, anukulena krishnanushilanam, they only want to serve the Lord, right? And because of which all their desires not get fulfilled, they go through this whole cycle of frustration in this material world. So these are the characteristics of a liberated soul. So this is the the whole understanding of liberated soul and conditioned soul, right? So we'll very quickly now summarize what we tried discussing today. A lot of discussion today. So we took off, yesterday we stopped at the understanding that absolute truth has various energies. So in today's discussion, we elaborated more on how the energies of the absolute truth are simultaneously one and different from him. So the Shakti, Shaktimator Abhedaha, that is a concept that we try to understand. The energy and the energetic are non-different. So there we understood how why the need to understand his energies, because if the material world, to explain the nature of the changing nature of the material world, while the absolute truth, its source, is unchanging. So how are these two then connected? One way of resolving it is just saying that the world itself doesn't exist. What are you talking about? There is no changing world. It's all one big illusion. That is a philosophy of Vivartavad, which the Mayavadi philosophers use. But the Vaishnava understanding is that no, the Shakti, the Lord does not change, but his energies go through transformation. And the nature of his energies, the Bhagavad Gita talks about these 6 concepts: Ishvara, Jiva, Prakriti, Kala, Karma, and Yoga, and how they are all interconnected. And all these put together is the concept of the absolute truth. And that absolute truth is Krishna. So we say, that is why we said Krishna is in everything, but everything is not Krishna. So that is the understanding of this oneness and difference with respect to the Lord's energies. And then in that context, we discussed these two examples of how remotely the sun is causing all these cyclic, the climatic changes, and yet despite so much of change, the sun itself remains independent and unchanging. Another example we saw is how sunlight and sun's light are simultaneously one and different. Then based on that understanding, especially the second example is with respect to the nature of Jiva. So the Jiva's consciousness is coming from the Supreme Lord's consciousness. And that the next principle we understood is that how the Jiva is marginal by nature. While the external energy, material energy is an external energy of the Lord, very, very clear, Bahiranga Shakti, and the Lord has his own internal potencies, the Jiva is in between, right? So that marginal nature of the Jiva causes it to be influenced by Maya. And because of which the Jiva could be either in a conditioned state or in a liberated state. And then we understood these two concepts about what does it mean to be a conditioned soul, what does it mean to be a liberated soul. Conditioned soul means where one is covered by this Maya, or one's consciousness is very much in tuned with material consciousness because of the Karanam Guna Sangasya, because of the three modes of material nature. And one is covered by this avidya and goes through this false identification, asmita, goes through these false attachments and aversions, and goes to this whole conditioned life. On the contrary, we also have the liberated jivas, and this process of liberation begins by turning towards the absolute truth. Right now, we are turning towards matter, our ego, intelligence, mind, senses, so on. And we have to change that focus towards the Supreme Lord, right? And that turning towards the Supreme Lord begins by turning towards the Guru, like that. And then what does it mean to be liberated? Liberation is not a change in state of existence, but state of consciousness, right? And that is the Swarupa Mukti that we spoke about from Bhagavatam. And there's also something called as Vastu Mukti. And even when you give up this body and mind, when you give up this gross body and the subtle body, what happens to the soul? The soul enters into a spiritual state where it realizes its spiritual personality. It has a spiritual effulgent form where it is engaged in spiritual activities, right? It is not a dry state. And then we saw the 8 characteristics of a liberated soul, right? Which is what makes a liberated soul so much different from the conditioned soul. All right. So let's end our discussion here. Let's very quickly see if anybody has any questions or comments. Okay, we have a question from Suradhyaksha Prabhu.
Hare Krishna Prabhuji, Dandvat Pranam Prabhuji.
Dandvat Prabhu, please go ahead.
Yeah. Prabhuji, I have always a slight confusion, like whenever I speak with my friends or with my relatives and I try to give them, some kind of what is this Krishna consciousness all about? And I always get confused, I don't have words to express, like, you gave a beautiful example of a soul, which has got 4 coverings, that is of ego, intelligence, mind, and senses. So for last 3, I very, very, very well understand. But this ego, I don't understand exactly how to explain it to somebody, so that, we can convince him what the soul's journey is all about, how these coverings are affecting the soul. So if you can tell something about the, ego, what exactly this means.
Okay. Yeah. So ego, ahankara. So there are 2 words here. Asmita and ahankara are 2 commonly used words. Asmita means a false sense of identification, and ahankara, aham karoti, a false sense of doership. Right? Both are pretty synonymous, but one is more in terms of identity, other is more in terms of action. So what exactly does this do is, ego basically means a sense of identity, which means that, I am a man, or I am a woman, I belong to a nation, So we all carry to operate in this material world, we need to carry some identity. Otherwise, just think about it. You cannot operate in this world without identity. So those identities, because you are dealing with material actions, we need a material identity to substantiate those material actions. Just like how I gave the example, for you to be happy because your national team won a sporting event, You need to have, first of all, an identity that you belong to that nation, and therefore suddenly once that identity comes, an attachment automatically comes, and therefore you become happy when your team wins, right? So for any interaction in any kind of a space, material or spiritual, whatever it may be, we need an identity, and with that identity comes all the things later, all the mind, intelligence, they all operate on the foundation of this identity. To give you another example, when imagine you're very, very hungry, you got late from a meeting or whatever, right? And you, as you walk out of your office, and you're going and you're figuring out, what should I do now? I'm hungry. So the first thought that comes to your mind is, I need food. But then when you walk out of that office, you notice there's a big lawn outside your office. Will you ever think, look at that green grass and say, oh wow, food is ready, right? Your intelligence never ever gives you idea that that green grass is food. But imagine if a soul that is trapped in the body of a cow, for whom the identity is, I am a cow, the first idea that it gets when it is hungry is green grass. So you see, you understand how the ego is so subtle. Our intelligence, mind, and senses, they operate beyond the ego. Because of its subtle nature, even your intelligence cannot comprehend the nature of the ego. Our thought process begins beyond an identity, right? In this case, in the example, you will only think of going to a restaurant which serves humanly food, because deep down that very identity that I'm a human is there by default within us. And our intelligence then says, oh, let me go to this restaurant. Then your mind will say, oh, let me order this which I last time had, which I like. Then the senses will indulge, and that is how you eat. But we never stop and ask the question, when I'm hungry, why am I desiring for humanly food? Why am I not interested in some bugs crawling on the street, because I'm not a lizard, or I'm not some whatever, a bug eater, or why am I not attracted by food, grass? So this is how subtle ego is. So ego is that sense of identity that we superimpose upon ourselves.
Okay, thank you so much, Prabhuji. Thank you so much.
Hare Krishna. Thank you. Hare Krishna. Gail Mataji would like to ask you a question.
Hare Krishna Prabhu. Yeah, just a couple questions today. One is I just need to get the proper spelling for when Maya has those two activities, covering, and the other. Can you just spell those two Sanskrit words for me?
Yeah, they are called Avarana, Atmika. Avarana. A-V-A-R-N-A.
Oh, A-V-R, not A-V-A-R.
A-V-A-R-N-A. Avarana.
And then the second is part of that.
Vikshepa Atmika. V-I-K S-H-E Vikshepa P-A Atmika. A-T-M-A.
Okay.
Yeah. Atmika. A-T-M-I.
Okay, and the first one was also Avarna Atmika?
Atmika, yes.
Okay, so Avarna means covering.
Covering. Vikshepa means to project. So the soul is projected into a false identity.
Okay, and so Atmika refers to the word soul. Atmika is like
a sense of self is Atmika. So the sense of self is first covered, and your sense of self is then projected into a false space, a false identity.
Okay. Just one other question, going back to yesterday, I had mentioned that this word knowledge, it refers to mood in the spiritual world, and things like similar thing to in the material world too. And we call them knowledge because they serve as an impetus for action, right? But and for any action, knowledge is required. But I'm still wondering why the word knowledge is used instead of, let's say,
motivation.
Yeah, exactly.
So actually, in the Vedic context, in the Vedic context, these two are synonymous in this way. Because what does intelligence basically do? It gives you a sense of determination to do things. So determination, motivation, so that part of you which gives you that motivation or impetus is what we call as intelligence, and that intelligence stores knowledge. So when you use the word information is something happening on a mental space. But motivation, knowledge, determination, conviction, inspiration, these are all happening at an intellectual space. Ideation, all of these are happening at an intellectual space. So that is what we are referring to. So so it's a more of a Sanskritam connotational thing. Maybe in English language, knowledge just means knowing things, right? But it's not just that. We are talking more about a deeper connotation that knowledge has, Gyan has in the Vedic context. It is the impetus for action. That is why we say our actions should always be based in knowledge, meaning that your knowledge should inspire your action. Like that.
Okay. And as you were saying just now, this motivation, inspiration, it does not happen on the level of the mind. Rather, it happens on the level of the intellect, which is interesting. Is so?
Yes. In the worldly sense, the material sense, yes, all our material actions, material motivation is all coming from that intellectual space.
Because I guess I'm a little surprised because I usually associate the intellect with that discerning faculty, discriminating faculty, not like a motivational faculty.
So once you discriminate between the right and the wrong, you also need the determination to follow the right. That is also a function of intelligence. So intelligence does two things: discrimination and determination. Both are provided by intelligence. And that is why we say that when we study scriptures, not only do we know the difference between right and wrong, we also develop the inner conviction to follow the right.
Yeah. Okay, Prabhu. Thank you so much.
Hare Krishna. Thank you.
Hare Krishna.
Let's see if anybody else has any questions or comments. We are 3 minutes over time, so let's see. All right. So this is so we covered 7 principles. In the next session, which is next weekend, we will actually see the last 3 concepts. So now we are slowly coming closer to our goal. We spoke about the liberated jivas. What does it take to liberate? But now, how does Krishna personally facilitate that liberation process? And especially how Krishna is, through what is the process of liberation and what is my ultimate goal? These are the themes which we are going to talk about in the next chapter. So the next session is going to be extremely powerful and a very, very sweet session, which is going to open the day. Right now we are at the threshold. We understood Kurukshetra in yesterday's session. We left Kurukshetra and we are somewhere on the way to Vrindavan in today's session. In the next session, we are going to enter into Vrindavan, the understanding of what Vrindavan literally means. So that is what we're going to see in the next session. So please do join us for our concluding session next week. We have only 1 session next weekend. So please do join us for that. So let's now close with the concluding prayers. Joining your palms together. Om Sahana Bhavatu Sahano Bhunattu Sah Viryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu Ma Vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Jaya Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. Hare Krishna 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 Hare Hare, Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare. Thank you all so much. See you all in the next session, the final session next week. Hare Krishna.